The story opens with a heated argument between our female lead, Madelyn, and her husband, Earl Nottingham. As tensions rise, Earl grabs her hand, accusing her of infidelity. Despite his harsh words, Madelyn remains silent, unwilling to explain herself. Gripping her tightly, Earl reminds her that no matter what happens, she is still his wife, and he, her husband. With teary eyes, Madelyn responds bitterly, "My husband? Do you really think you have the right to call yourself that? You never once treated me as your wife. This marriage is over." Her words fuel Earl's anger, and he tightens his grip, threatening that she cannot escape him, not even in death. He adds coldly that she will remain, even if the cursed manor collapses around them. Summoning her strength, Madelyn pulls her hand free and declares that she refuses to stay any longer. She cannot bear to spend the rest of her life trapped in the manor, living like a ghost. As Madelyn storms away from Earl Nottingham, her anger blinds her, and she misses a step on the staircase, tumbling to the ground. As she lies there, pain coursing through her body, her mind drifts to her husband's accusations of her loving another man. It wasn't love, she thinks bitterly, it was revenge. Revenge on the man who had imprisoned her in that cursed manor for years, letting her fade away. It was revenge on Earl Nottingham, a bitter act that ultimately led to her own demise. As life begins to slip from her, she reflects on the 6 long years she has endured. In the end, she was left with nothing but the label of a disgraced, unfaithful wife. The last thing she sees is her husband, crying out in anguish, and the sight fills her with a grim satisfaction. "If I caused him even one moment of despair, then it's enough for me," she thinks. Whether it be in life or death, she was ready to accept her fate. If hell awaited her, she was prepared to join Hades, where at least she would be free of her husband's grasp. But when she opens her eyes, she is neither in heaven nor hell. Instead, she finds herself back at Roanfield Manor, back to when she was 17. In 1914, the year Madelyn's misfortune began, life still held a semblance of happiness for her and her father, despite her mother's passing. Her father was enamored with the extravagant lifestyle of an aristocrat, while Madelyn was fixated on little more than pretty dresses, blissfully unaware of the changing world around them. It was inevitable that they wouldn't be able to keep pace with the times. One fateful night, everything changed. Her father's obsession with luxury led to a disastrous business venture that wiped out their entire fortune. That same night, in a fit of despair, he hanged himself in his study. When Madelyn read his will, she found not a single word of care or provision for her future. She was left utterly alone, a young girl with no dowry, and no prospects. With no other options, she was forced into a marriage with Earl Nottingham, a man she had never even met. For a girl in her position, this should have been a stroke of fortune, but fate was cruel. The war had left Earl Nottingham deeply scarred, and what could have been a lifeline for Madelyn turned into a slow descent into despair. Together, they dragged each other into the depths of misery, and their marriage, which began out of necessity, ended in tragedy. As Madelyn reflects on her sudden return to the past, she realizes that if she's 17 again, it won't be long before they lose their fortune. If she can prevent her father from making that disastrous investment, maybe, just maybe, their future will change. But the challenge is immense. Her father is off gallivanting on a grand tour, indulging in luxuries, when they should be tightening their belts and saving every penny. Deep in thought, she's startled by her father's voice calling her name. He asks if she came to welcome him home, his usual carefree smile on his face. Then, with a wave of his hand, he invites her into the carriage. Acknowledging her second chance, Madelyn steels herself, she won't waste this opportunity. She must find a way for them to navigate the difficult times ahead, but above all, she has to avoid any connection with Earl Nottingham. Determined, she steps into the carriage, ready to take control of her fate. But her heart sinks when her father, beaming with excitement, says, "I've invited a special guest today." Turning to the man beside him, he says, "Let me introduce you to my daughter, Master Nottingham." Madelyn's blood runs cold. Just when she had resolved to avoid him at all costs, fate had other plans. As her father chats enthusiastically with their guest, praising his business skills, Madelyn sits frozen in disbelief. She can't shake the thought, is this really Earl Nottingham? In her previous life, he was a violent, bitter man, completely closed off. The man before her seems calm, composed, and nothing like the monster she remembers. Her father breaks her thoughts, mentioning that he heard Earl enjoys horseback riding, and Earl smiles and confirms, saying he particularly enjoys racing. Madelyn watches him closely, still in shock. This man, she thinks, doesn't limp, doesn't shout, and seems utterly different from the Earl she knew. She grapples with the impossible reality before her. How could this charming, composed man be the same one who once made my life a living nightmare? In Madelyn's past life, by the age of 22, her hopes for a peaceful marriage with Earl Nottingham were crushed. On her wedding day, she had been anxious, wondering if she could be a good wife. It wasn't that she disliked Earl at first, she genuinely wanted their marriage to work, even without love. She had vowed to stand by him, to be loyal and supportive, to help him heal, and to become a wife he could admire. But those dreams were shattered on the very night of their wedding. Earl Nottingham never came to their bedroom, not that night, nor the next, nor the days that followed. He refused to spend even a single moment with her. Madelyn often voiced her frustration about being ignored, and though he always reassured her that he hadn't forgotten her, his actions said otherwise. One day, she even complained of boredom, hoping he might spend more time with her. Instead of offering her his attention, Earl bought her a puppy to keep her company. But even the puppy seemed as frightened as she was, sensing the coldness and tension that surrounded their home. As they arrive at Roanfield Manor, Madelyn's father proudly introduces Earl Nottingham to their home, emphasizing its rare Renaissance style. He eagerly orders the finest tea and cakes to be prepared for their esteemed guest. Then, turning to his daughter, he suggests she show Earl around the manor while they wait. But Madelyn, desperate to avoid any more interaction, immediately objects, claiming she isn't feeling well. Her father, persistent as ever, suggests instead that she play something on the piano during their afternoon tea. Madelyn apologizes again, saying she'd prefer to rest. Just as her father is about to push the issue, Earl Nottingham raises his hand and calmly says he doesn't mind. "It was nice to meet you, miss," he says, bowing courteously. Relieved, Madelyn apologizes once more and excuses herself, all while a storm of thoughts whirls in her mind. Earl Nottingham is standing right there, she realizes, but this is the version of him untouched by the misfortune that would later ruin his life. The thought nags at her, should I intervene and try to change his fate? But deep down, she knows it would be best if this brief encounter remained their last. If she could avoid him now, she might escape the tragic past life that once bound them. With that, she resolves to distance herself from him, hoping this would be the end of their connection. Later in her room, Madelyn sits flipping through paperwork, her mind preoccupied with the dire need to sell the manor and their land before the war breaks out. She calculates their chances. If they can move to the countryside and watch their spending, they might just survive. But there's a bigger problem. If she can't stop her father's reckless gambling and extravagant lifestyle, they'll end up penniless, living on the streets. Deep in thought, she's interrupted by a knock at the door. Her father asks to come in, and she permits him, mentioning she was just about to see him. To her surprise, her father hands her an envelope, explaining it's an invitation for her debut in London. He adds that it's about time she entered high society. Madelyn, however, knows better. It's no time for balls and parties with financial disaster looming. She asks if attending is really necessary, a question that catches her father off guard. His surprise turns to concern as he asks if she's unhappy. He points out how she's been nagging him all day about cutting down expenses, and now, to his dismay, she doesn't even seem interested in getting married. Madelyn, unbothered, sips her tea and calmly denies ever saying she didn't want to marry. Frustrated, her father insists that refusing her debut is practically the same as rejecting marriage altogether. He even reveals he's bought a townhouse in London for them to stay in during the season. At this, she suggests selling the house instead and warns him against investing in the wine business. Shocked, her father demands to know how she learned about that, suspecting she may have gone through his letters. He sternly tells her to stay out of his business, saying such matters aren't for young ladies. With an icy calm, Madelyn picks up the invitation and delivers an ultimatum. If he invests any money in the wine business, she will refuse to make her debut and never marry. Smiling sweetly, she adds that if he continues to be stubborn, she'll gladly join a convent and become a nun. Furious and trembling with anger, her father confines her to her room until she apologizes. But it's clear to him that he has little choice, he must bend to her conditions, or risk losing everything. In the next scene, Madelyn and her father arrive at a grand event in London. While mingling with the crowd, she covertly ensures that her father hasn't hidden away any copies of contracts related to the wine business. As she stays on alert, her father, concerned, asks why she hasn't accepted any dance offers, noting that she has already scared away 6 proposals. Madelyn, disinterested, replies that she's simply not sure yet. Her father reminds her of her duty as a Ronefield. She needs to marry well to secure the family's future. Frustrated, he trudges off, muttering about how he can't understand his own daughter. Madelyn, on the other hand, knows that the social season will soon be cut short by the impending war. She's decided she will no longer play the role of a decorative, passive woman. This time, she wants to shape her destiny. As long as she can prevent her family's financial ruin, she is determined to carve out her own path, perhaps even learning to play the piano as a way to secure a job after the war. With that in mind, she daydreams of a future where she can be independent. As she stands lost in thought, Earl Nottingham suddenly approaches her. "You seem bored by the festivities," he remarks, breaking her reverie. Startled, Madelyn turns to him and asks, "Doesn't this all seem strange to you?" But Earl only smiles, replying that everyone seems to be having a good time. Madelyn presses on, saying it unnerves her to see people enjoying themselves, oblivious to the dangers looming on the horizon. Earl, ever the optimist, tries to lift her spirits, saying, "We should enjoy the present while we can. Refusing to enjoy it won't stop the future from coming." His words frustrate her slightly, though she masks it with a calm demeanor, assuring him that she is relaxed. "It's just that all this pomp feels meaningless," she confesses. "Not that it lacks value entirely, I don't begrudge anyone their dancing, but it's not what I want for myself." With a charming smile, Earl looks at her and asks, "What if dancing with me is what you want, miss?" He then bows gracefully, extending his hand, and formally asks her to dance. Madelyn hesitates, her mind swirling. She had no intention of saving Earl Nottingham in this new life. Her plan was to avoid him altogether. She has no obligation to involve herself in his future. But she knows what's coming for him, the war, the injuries, the darkness that will consume him. His body and spirit will be broken. Perhaps, she thinks, just one small push in the right direction could make a difference. If it can change his life for the better, even just a little, perhaps she could afford him just one word of advice. In the next scene, it's revealed that Earl Nottingham's friends had been discussing who would dare approach Madelyn first before he finally summoned the courage to ask her to dance. As the two continue to waltz, onlookers notice them, especially 2 ladies whispering about how they're already on their 4th dance together. One of the women wonders aloud who Madelyn is, intrigued by the fact that she's been dancing with the elusive Master Earl Nottingham for so long. While they dance, Earl, noticing her trembling hands, softly calls her name and asks if she's okay. He remarks that her hands are shaking and that she's looking at him as though she pities him. His observation catches Madelyn off guard, and she finds herself suddenly overwhelmed by conflicting thoughts. Should she confide in him, or should she let go of his hand and walk away, severing their connection for good? If she stays, there's a possibility that their fates will intertwine once again, and she might be drawn back into the years of loneliness and misery that defined her past life. Her mind races back to a memory from her previous life when she was 26 years old. On that day, she had been out in the garden with her dog, only to discover that one of her precious roses had been cut off. Soon after, it began to rain, and her dog went missing in the downpour. Desperate, she insisted on searching for her pet herself, despite her maid's protests. As she argued with them, Earl arrived and demanded that she come inside. Madelyn tearfully tried to explain that her dog was lost, but Earl coldly dismissed her concern, saying that it was just an animal and he couldn't allow anyone to get hurt over a mere dog. The tears that fell from her eyes stung as she told him that the dog was the only one in the manor who truly cared for her, but his only response was a distant tap on her shoulder and a command to return indoors. Snapped back to the present by Earl's voice, Madelyn blinks away the haunting memory. He asks her once more if she's all right, his eyes filled with genuine concern. Madelyn brushes off Earl's concern, assuring him that she's fine. With a graceful curtsy, she thanks him for their time together and bids him good night. Despite his repeated attempts to call her back, she ignores him completely. Watching her walk away, Earl mutters under his breath, disappointed that after 4 dances, Madelyn still hasn't warmed to him. Later that evening at the dining table, Madelyn can't help but reflect on her situation. She hadn't expected to avoid Earl forever within the tight-knit world of high society, but she also hadn't anticipated sitting directly across from him. As she picks at her food, Earl and his sister Isabelle continue to bicker, and she observes the scene in silence. Their squabbling takes her back to her previous life when she was married to Earl and he had no living family members left. His younger brother, Eric, had volunteered for the front lines and tragically died in battle, while Isabelle had died in a car crash before the war even started. Madelyn remembered the rumors circulating at the time, that Isabelle's death wasn't accidental, but a result of her relationship with a man of much lower status. Unable to bear the weight of society's judgment, the pair had allegedly chosen to die together. In her past life, Madelyn had often thought that Earl might not have been so broken had his siblings survived. After Isabelle's death, he refused to touch her belongings, leaving everything in her room exactly as it was, as though preserving the memory of her was the only way to keep his grief alive. It was as if he needed the constant reminder of his regrets and sorrows, something that had added to his emotional distance in their marriage. In her past life at age 22, Madelyn had wandered into Lady Isabelle's room, drawn by the piano and its polished, untouched appearance. The room was pristine, as though Isabelle had just stepped out and might return at any moment. As Madelyn admired the piano, a photograph slipped to the floor. She bent to pick it up and found a picture of Isabelle with a man she didn't recognize. Curiosity piqued, Madelyn moved toward the piano to place the photo back, and in doing so, she noticed a piece of sheet music. It was a song Isabelle had written for her lover. Madelyn couldn't help but wonder what kind of woman Isabelle Nottingham had been, whether she was a refined, elegant lady who spent her days playing music or a passionate woman willing to die for love. Either way, it struck Madelyn that Isabelle's piano, when she was alive, must have brought warmth and brightness to the otherwise gloomy manor. But just as she pondered this, Earl had burst into the room, his face dark with anger, ordering her out. Confused, Madelyn had tried to remind him that she was his wife and had a right to be in the house, but his cold warning cut her off. He made it clear she was never to set foot in that room again. At the time, she had assumed his reaction was due to the deep attachment he had for his sister, but now, seeing Earl and Isabelle at each other's throats, it seemed more complicated than that. In the present, their argument escalates. Isabelle rises from the table, furious, shouting that Earl is a lowlife, just as he had once insulted her lover. She grabs her hat and storms out, her parting words ringing in Madelyn's ears. "I can't breathe in this place anymore. I don't want to live here with you." It's at that moment that Madelyn recognizes the hat Isabelle is wearing. A chilling realization settles over her. Today is the day Isabelle passes on. Madelyn quickly excuses herself from the table and rushes after Isabelle, who's already leaving. She grabs Isabelle's hand and bluntly asks if she's going to meet her lover. Stunned, Isabelle stops and angrily asks if Madelyn has been eavesdropping, but Madelyn denies it. Still suspicious, Isabelle begins to walk away until Madelyn mentions her lover by name. This makes Isabelle pause, and she demands to know how Madelyn knows about him. Madelyn reassures her that she won't tell anyone. To be sure, Isabelle asks if she's spying for her brother, but Madelyn denies it. Then, holding Isabelle's hands, Madelyn pleads with her not to fall under her brother's control. She shares how she once let a man dominate her life, leading to her downfall and pushing her onto a path of no return out of sheer anger. When Madelyn took hold of Isabelle's hands, she wasn't thinking about her past with Earl. Her only focus was on saving Isabelle from the anger that would blind her to the danger ahead. She offers a few words of support, but before the moment can continue, Earl appears and interrupts. He tries to convince Madelyn to stay out of the situation between him and Isabelle, but Isabelle stands her ground, saying she will stay with Madelyn. Earl, with a sigh, reminds his sister that every action has consequences. As for Madelyn, he isn't sure how she got involved with Isabelle but warns her to stay out of their family issues. With that, he left. Later, Madelyn sits flipping through the newspaper. She remarks that there were once many articles about Isabelle, but now there are none, which suggests that Isabelle must be doing fine. What a relief! As Madelyn reflects on it, she begins to understand Earl's reaction to the piano incident from her past. But her thoughts quickly shift to the upcoming social event at the Culhath's country estate. At the Culhath family's country estate, Madelyn arrives and scans the room, noting with relief that Earl isn't there. This gives her the chance to meet someone new, or so she thinks. Lost in thought, she's approached by a young man who greets her with a charming smile and offers his arm. They sit together, and as he tries to start a conversation, he offers her a glass of wine. Just as she's about to take it, Earl suddenly appears and reaches for the glass, interrupting the moment. He had just arrived with his siblings, Eric and Isabelle. The conversation drifts towards the possibility of another war. As it unfolds, Earl turns to Madelyn, asking for her thoughts on the subject. Caught off guard, she begins by acknowledging that military force has often driven innovation but adds that it's people who justify evil as necessary who start wars. Earl gives her a knowing smirk and calmly asks if that's truly what she believes, leaving her to wonder if she had been too blunt in her response. After a brief pause in the conversation, Eric lightens the mood by admitting he can't keep up with all the political talk. He shifts the topic, asking if any of them plan to attend Wimbledon to watch the tennis matches. The group continues to chat casually, but Madelyn quietly slips away without a word. She heads out to the balcony, lost in thought. She hadn't meant to openly disagree with Earl, but oddly enough, he didn't seem upset. In fact, he almost seemed amused by her honesty. As she leans against the balcony rail, she spots Isabelle walking with a man who is clearly her lover. Watching them, Madelyn murmurs to herself about how deeply in love they seem, to the point where Isabelle might even be willing to sacrifice everything for him. A pang of longing hits her. She wishes she had experienced a love like that. Her thoughts are interrupted when Earl calls her name, wanting to talk. She quickly turns, realizing that if he gets any closer, he'll see Isabelle and her lover together. Madelyn quickly steps closer to Earl, blocking his path to keep him from seeing Isabelle and her lover. Then he clears his throat and starts to speak, telling her he wants to address what happened last time with Isabelle. "It was wrong of me to chide you," he admits. As he talks, Madelyn discreetly glances toward Isabelle, checking to see if she's safely out of sight while also trying to steer Earl away from the balcony. She suggests they head back inside, but just as she turns to leave, Earl stops her with a remark. "You puzzle me," he says. He goes on to explain that, for some time, he's had the impression that she doesn't particularly like him, perhaps even despises him. Though he brushes it off as his imagination, he adds that he hopes her disdain isn't too deep, as it could be a loss for both of them. He finishes by saying that no one knows what the future holds, leaving her with a subtle hint before urging her to head inside because of the cold. After responding to Earl, Madelyn politely suggests that he go back inside, mentioning that she wants to enjoy the scenery a bit longer. Sensing her firm refusal to let him linger, he nods and tells her he'll respect her wishes for today. But before he leaves, he makes it clear that he doesn't plan on backing down anymore. As he turns to go, Madelyn's thoughts drift to Isabelle and her lover, hidden away in the garden. How absurd she must look to those two passionate souls, she muses. To them, Earl must seem laughable, a man who mistakes obsession for love. He stands there, trying to shield her from the wind, yet his dark shadow looms over her, heavy and suffocating. She knows better than to let him stir false hopes in her heart. In her past life, when she was 25, she had a moment of deep reflection. Lying in bed, questions swirled in her mind. How much longer would she live this way? What would happen to her dog, Corey, when she was gone? Worse yet, what if Corey died first, leaving her alone in this wretched place? The thought of losing him was unbearable, and she feared she might truly lose her sanity if it happened. But did she really have to live out her days like a ghost haunting the manor? With newfound determination, she suddenly sprang out of bed, reassuring Corey that she would handle everything. The next morning, Earl sat in his office, focused on his work, when his butler entered with unexpected news. His wife had left the manor in the middle of the night. Meanwhile, Madelyn, having fled to a cinema in London, was overwhelmed with disbelief and excitement. She had actually run away from home. Sitting in the dark theater, she couldn't help but think about the chaos likely unfolding back at the manor. What about her husband? Was he relieved to be rid of her, or was he upset? Whatever the case, she pushed those thoughts aside and let herself get lost in the movie, which eventually moved her to tears. Afterward, she met up with Corey and apologized for keeping him waiting. She was visibly happy, almost glowing with the freedom of being away from the manor. As she started thinking about what chores she needed to take care of, a letter arrived for her. It read, "I will wait for you at the station, Earl Nottingham." The moment she saw it, a wave of sadness washed over her. She had thought that escaping to London meant she was free, but it seemed she was mistaken. Yet, despite the disappointment, there was also a small part of her that felt a sense of relief. Now at the age of 17, Madelyn finds herself at a social event, quietly wrestling with a question that had been troubling her. Was there no way to live comfortably without relying on an inheritance or marrying into wealth? Lost in thought, she barely notices when Earl approaches her, commenting that she always seemed fatigued. He suggests, half-jokingly, that maybe the London air doesn't agree with her. She smiles and admits that the air in London is bad, but it was her studies that kept her up at night. Curious, Earl asks if she's studying ancient Greek. With a wry smile, she replies that it is something like a Greek tragedy. She'd been contemplating how to avoid an inevitable fate. Blushing slightly, she confesses that she had been thinking about how to sustain herself, but Earl dismisses her worries as something no young noblewoman should concern herself with. He advises her to let someone else solve her problems rather than agonizing over them alone. After a pause, Madelyn asks him a question that catches him off guard. Had he ever hated himself so much that it led him to despise others as well? Earl, surprised, responds, "Why would I hate myself?" Realizing how inappropriate the question is, she quickly apologizes. Before she can say anything more, Earl's friend rushes over with shocking news: her father has gone bankrupt. Madelyn storms out of the gathering, her mind racing, and heads straight to her father's bedroom. On her way, a maid tries to stop her, saying her father had ordered that no one was to enter. This only deepens her dread, as she feared a repeat of the fate of her past life. Ignoring the warning, she slams open the door, calling out for her father, but when she enters, she's startled to find him sitting with the butler. Without hesitation, she angrily demands to know what the bankruptcy news is all about, recalling that just the other day he had supposedly burned the contracts. To her shock, her father broke down in tears, explaining that the trading company he had invested all his fortune into had collapsed, leaving him ruined. Grasping her hand, he pleaded with her, saying she was now his only hope. As he spoke, Madelyn finds herself reflecting on the fact that, unlike in her previous life, her father was still alive. This time, she could help him. Gently patting his hand, she reassures him that as long as he's alive, they could find a way through this. Her first suggestion was to sell their land and townhouse, and then work together to pay off the remaining debt. But her father recoils at the idea, questioning why a nobleman would lower himself to work. Then, he brings up Earl Nottingham, reminding her that the Earl had shown interest in her. Madelyn tries to explain that they had only danced a few times and that it wasn't anything serious, but her father wasn't listening. He insists that her only path forward is to find a suitable suitor, especially someone as wealthy as the Earl. Later, Madelyn returns to the party, her mind still occupied with the financial crisis her family is facing. As she tries to collect her thoughts, a drunk man stumbles toward her, asking for a dance. She politely declines, explaining that she isn't feeling well, but the man scowls and makes an offhand comment about the misfortune that had struck her family. He started to belittle her and her family's situation, and though his words stung, Madelyn remained calm, knowing that losing her composure would only make things worse. After enduring his harsh words, she simply bows and thanks him for his advice, trying to end the conversation gracefully. Just then, Earl stepped in, commanding the music to be turned up, loudly remarking that something was grating on his ears, likely the ramblings of a drunk fool who couldn't tell the difference between wise counsel and rudeness. His intervention was an elegant way of dismissing the man without direct confrontation. The drunk, clearly embarrassed, slunk away, and Madelyn stood there, fidgeting, unsure of what to do next. Before she can react, Isabelle hurries over, grabbing her hand and whisking her away with the excuse of wanting to look at a new dress catalog. As they walk together, Isabelle suddenly asked if Madelyn can foresee the future or commune with the dead. Confused, Madelyn shakes her head, denying it. But Isabelle was fascinated, remarking on how mysterious Madelyn seemed. After all, she had known her lover's name and seemed to predict her every move. They chat for a while, and during their conversation, Isabelle casually mentions that Madelyn reminds her of someone. When Madelyn curiously asked who, Isabelle smiles and says it was just an old friend. Then, Isabelle leans in and shares a secret: her brother, Earl, is planning to invite Madelyn to their house soon. As Madelyn watches everything unfold, a wave of realization washes over her. She thought so much had changed in this life, yet the powerful tide of fate seemed to be pulling her back into the same current she had fought to escape in the past. Unfortunately, this segment ends here. We hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one.